Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I am pleased to rise and address the fall economic statement. We've certainly heard a lot of things in the chamber today, including some rhetorical flights of partisan fancy, the kind we've come to expect from the Conservative leader, with some very well-rehearsed chanting by the Conservatives at the end. But I'd like to be a little more serious than that in my remarks, because I recognize that Canadians are going through a very difficult time, and we've heard about it a lot. We've talked a lot about it in this chamber, and today was an opportunity for government to show that it's not out of touch, and to show that it is prepared to move and to address the serious issues of our time with the sense of urgency that they deserve. And I don't want to, spoil anything for anyone, but I have to say it's a real disappointment. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which I think this is a very disappointing document. I'll also have occasion to mention some of the things that I think government has talked about here that are not bad things, but I think the overriding theme has to be one of disappointment. What are the crises that we're facing? Well, we're certainly facing a global climate crisis. That much is very clear. Anyone who's been paying attention to the news, and unfortunately, you don't have to pay attention to the news if your house is on fire to know how severe climate change is getting and the important personal and economic consequences that it's having for Canadians, in addition to what it's doing to the environment. We're facing a housing crisis, and you don't have to go far. Again, you don't have to watch the news. You just have to walk out into your neighborhood. And odds are, no matter what neighborhood you live in, more and more neighborhoods are finding that they have people, friends and neighbors and family members who have lived in those neighborhoods their whole life, who can no longer afford to live in those neighborhoods and don't know where to go. So they're setting up camp in the park across the street because they don't know where else to go and they can't afford to put a roof over their head. These are the kinds of challenges that we're facing as a country. And it took a long time to get here. It took a long time to get here in respect of the climate crisis. I know my father mentioned the climate crisis in the parlance of the time in the early 1980s in this place. He did. And said that we needed to do things now. Can you imagine how cheap it would have been to address the climate crisis in the 1980s instead of waiting until now? I also know that the federal NDP caucus in the 90s, when the Liberals canceled the National Housing Strategy, were talking about the crisis that it would create in housing. So I can't, from where I sit, pretend in this place that these are new problems, or that it was the Conservative leader who 2 years ago foresaw the housing crisis. The NDP saw this coming in the 90s. It's why we said we needed to continue to invest in co-op housing. It's why we said the federal government had to show up to continue building social housing. Right. And we've been sounding the alarm for over 30 years that Canada was going to find itself in this place. Why were we doing that? Because we knew you can't fix a housing crisis overnight. It's the kind of thing that you need continued, predictable investment year over year to continue to meet demand. And now that we've found ourselves here, in part because of the government that the Conservative leader was a part of, but as I say, not just that, the Liberal government in the 90s, and then the Harper government, and now this government who's had 8 years to address this problem, and it's only gotten worse under them. So these problems have been a long time in the making, and Canadians are beginning to really feel the hurt. What did we hear today from the Finance Minister? We heard from the Finance Minister that Canada has the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. We heard from the Finance Minister that rating agencies are renewing Canada's AAA credit rating. We heard from the Finance Minister that Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7. And what did we hear about their trumpeted new investment in housing? That it ain't coming until 2025. So how is it that Canada could be in the best fiscal position in the G7 and not afford to begin investing right now in the housing that we need for Canadians, for vulnerable Canadians, for sure, who don't have the means to pay rent in this economy, for working Canadians who don't have the means to pay rent or afford a mortgage in this economy, but also for the businesses that are telling us that the major barrier they face to growing their business is that they can't find a place to house their workers, that the people that they would like to have come work for them don't have a place to live and so can't come to the community where their business is. How is it that Canada, that we can have a deputy prime minister and a finance minister with the gall to get up and brag about Canada's fiscal position in comparison to everyone else in the world, and then say the cupboard is bare when it comes to addressing some of the most important crises of our time? Now, I'm quite familiar with the announcements that she made in respect of housing, the replenishment of the co-investment fund, because I've stood in this very place and called for that. And I've sat across the table from Liberals and demanded that they make investments in social housing. And I didn't demand that they made those investments in 2025. We demand that they make them right now. Likewise, with the replenishment of the RCFI, or the Rental Construction Financing Initiative, which is a mouthful, but really just means low-interest loans for people who want to build housing, whether they're building market housing or nonprofit housing. And we expect in the future, and have been advocating, that post-secondary institutions, universities, colleges, should also be able to access that funding.
That's right.
That folks that want to build housing for seniors should be able to access that funding. That low-interest financing should be made far more widely available, so that it's not just a honeypot for developers, but it's a place for proven organizations across Canada, including nonprofit organizations, building housing for the vulnerable, have the opportunity to access that funding and ensure that there's going to be more housing, and housing on more accessible terms. So a huge disappointment that it didn't come now. I talked about what, not my words, what the finance minister and the deputy prime minister herself had to say, which was Canada's strong fiscal position. The question still is, well, how do you pay for it? How would you find the money? We already have a deficit, albeit the lowest deficit in the G7. Well, a 1-point increase in the corporate tax rate in Canada, which I would remind you, Mr. Speaker, in the year 2000 was 28% and is only 15% today, would generate over $3 billion a year. So to recapitalize the co-investment fund to the tune of $1 billion and not start that for 2 years, you could triple the recapitalization and do it every year in perpetuity.
That's right.
With a 1% increase. A 1% increase in the corporate tax rate. That's not a bad deal for corporations that say they can't find enough workers to keep making money because there's no housing.
That's right.
Exactly.
Well, let's ask them to help build the housing that is going to help them grow their business and employ Canadians and make sure they have a roof over their head. That's a fair deal. What's not a fair deal is to have cut the corporate tax rate from 28% in the year 2000 to 15% today and not have Canadians be able to find a home. That's not fair. That's not good policy. So let's not pretend that Canada can't afford to move, and move with urgency this year, on significantly increasing the amount of social housing and affordable housing builds that the federal government is going to directly finance in whole or in part. It's simply not true, and it's irresponsible of the Liberals to cave to the demands of the Conservative Party and multinational corporations that don't care what happens to Canadians in terms of their housing, as long as they're able to pay bigger dividends to their shareholders and larger salaries to their CEOs.
Exactly.
That's the real coalition.
That's
in
right.
Parliament, Mr. Speaker. That's the real coalition, and it's been in power for far too long. How else could we pay for housing? Well, Mr. Speaker, we've heard reports this year of tens of billions of dollars that have been paid to consulting firms like KPMG and others. Well, why are we paying through the nose for high-priced consultants when we have one of the best civil services in the world that can do the work that we need them to do, instead of paying high-class consultants big profits in order to tell us how to cut taxes and put more people out of a home? That doesn't make a lot of sense. We saw the Liberals are quite prepared to spend money on scandals like ArriveCan. Why can't they spend it on housing instead?
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
Well, because their friends are already housed, Mr. Speaker, and they're looking to make a buck. But that's not a good excuse for Canadians that are living on the street and wondering when, not when Canada is going to do something unprecedented, not when Canada is going to do something new, but when Canada is going to start doing what it did for decades following the Second World War, simply do it again. I'll tell you, if Canadians in the 1950s could figure out how to build a home for everybody, surely in the 21st century, with all of the wealth and prosperity that Canada has enjoyed over the last 70 years, we can figure out to do it now and figure it out how to do it here.
Hear, hear.
Now, that's just the deficiencies of what they have announced. Never mind the fact that when you look to BC, there you have an NDP government that has taken upon themselves to start a nonprofit acquisition fund. Why do we need a nonprofit acquisition fund? Because in Canada today, for every 1 unit of affordable housing we're building, we're losing 15. Why are we losing those units, Mr. Speaker? Well, this comes back to the question that I had for the leader of the Conservative Party, which was why, when he was in cabinet and in the time that he says he was Minister of Housing, the Harper government cut the operating grants to co-op housing and other nonprofit organizations that run housing that made rents affordable. Why did they do that? The reason that we've lost hundreds of thousands of affordable units over the last number of years is because they could no longer afford to operate with the subsidized rent that they used to operate with. Because the leader of the Conservative Party, when he sat at the cabinet table and when he was Minister of Housing, refused to renew the federal operating grants. And now what we have are companies that come in and buy those buildings because the current operators can't afford to operate them anymore, not with the tenants that are there. The corporate landlords don't mind. They kick out the tenants. They renovate the suites, they jack up the rent, and they invite Canadians with higher salaries to come in and rent those spaces. And so who's got the back of the people that can't afford to rent a luxury apartment in today's market? The NDP has their back, that's for sure. Absolutely. And what's becoming more and more apparent is that this government, after 8 years of trying, does not.
That's right.
It simply doesn't. Even if they had the good intention, which I think you could reasonably call into question, the competence clearly isn't there to deliver on a national housing strategy that can build enough units to ensure that this housing crisis doesn't stretch into my grandchildren's lifetime. And part of that is just a fascination and a fixation, and this is another thing that the coalition between Liberals and Conservatives share, with only market solutions. Yep. As I said, there was a time when the Canadian government built a lot of units, and it didn't build all the units. Canada's always had mostly a market for housing. But we used to build enough non-market housing that the people that couldn't afford to play in the market could still get a home. And they weren't sacrificing their food or their prescription drugs to try and get into the housing market that they couldn't really afford while paying for all the necessities of life. So the issue is that we're not doing that anymore, and we have to be doing that. And if it weren't for the actions of the leader of the Conservative Party and his government, or if this government had made good on their promise to renew the operating grants. But this is what I mean, Mr. Speaker, when I talk about the real coalition in the House of Commons. It's Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And so the one says, when they're not in power, oh, what you're doing is so bad, that's really terrible, we're going to fix it when we get in. And then they get in, and lo and behold, they carry on. They carry on the policies of the previous government. And so Canadians never know how to get a break. Tommy Douglas used to tell the story of Mouseland, which put this point very well. And I encourage anyone watching, when they're done watching this speech, to look that up on YouTube or elsewhere. And it will pain you to see how relevant that very old story truly is. We also think that it's high time that real estate investment trusts stop getting the sweetheart tax deal that they've had since the 90s, because they've been part of the rent-eviction problem as well. And when the Liberals indicate notionally in this fall economic statement they're excited to get the Canadian Infrastructure Bank involved, all you can do is cringe. I mean, the Infrastructure Bank has hardly delivered a successful project, even where it's tried, like even within its mandate. It has struggled to deliver a project. Telling Canadians, good news, the Infrastructure Bank is getting involved, is so out of touch. I don't even know where to begin. And it raises an important specter, which is that public infrastructure that's required in order to build more housing. So whether that's bigger sewer pipes or better wastewater management or all the things that you need in order to be able to support a number of units, it raises the specter that this government isn't interested in seeing municipalities own that infrastructure as they properly should, but are instead interested in using federal public dollars to finance the takeover of municipal infrastructure by private investors who are going to be interested in seeking a profit on that. And we know from many examples of P3s across the country that when you get the private sector involved in what should be public infrastructure, what happens is that you pay more and you get less. So that is by no means a hopeful thing for Canadians who want to see the kind of infrastructure development we need in order to expand our housing stock. And you know, when we talk about municipalities and housing, I think it's important. I was at breakfast with the Association of Manitoba Municipalities today. What are they talking about? They're talking about their very sincere and real desire to get more housing in their communities because it's a barrier to investment. They have businesses that want to invest, that want to build new facilities, but as I said earlier, can't do it because they know that there isn't enough housing for the workforce that they want for their business. Now, are these municipal politicians celebrating that? Are they shouting for joy and saying, yeah, that's great, we're keeping the investment out by not having enough housing? Absolutely not. And it's strange that one should have to say such a thing. But with the leader of the Conservative Party spending so much time in here pretending like municipal politicians don't care to be able to get more housing in their community or aren't interested in attracting that investment to their community, I think it's high time somebody set the record straight. And I can tell you that a community that's already so cash-strapped that they can't build enough housing to bring in the kind of investment that they want to see their local economy prosper, slashing their resources is not going to help them build more units the next year. It's only going to compound the problem. It's got to be one of the dumbest ideas on offer in Canadian politics today. But when we talk about investment and we talk about Canadian businesses, there's a whole bunch of businesses that started up when the Canada Green Homes Initiative got started because they wanted to become the folks that do the evaluation of how well insulated a house is, or they wanted to be the person that came and installed a heat pump, or they wanted to be the person that helped Canadians save on their energy bills and reduce their emissions. And what we don't see in here is a commitment to renew that program. What we do here outside this place are a lot of businesses that are concerned because they thought the Liberal government had a long-term commitment to reducing emissions. They thought it wasn't a gimmick. And they should be forgiven for thinking that. And it's not too late for the Liberals to do the right thing and to come out and to commit to renewing this program, both so that Canadians can continue to have access to the funds they need to renovate their home, reduce our emissions, and save money on their heating bill, but also to save the businesses that have invested in good faith in the skills and the equipment that they need in order to be the people to drive that forward. What else could we do for businesses that isn't done in this fall economic statement? Well, an extension of the Canada Emergency Business Account, the CEBA loans, for the repayable period would make a huge difference not only to those businesses that are in serious distress and are deserving of having that credit extended, but also to the government who presumably would like to be paid again. And I don't know how a government could think that forcing businesses into bankruptcy that they have loans with is a way to get the money back. Who benefits? Who benefits? Workers lose their jobs, owners lose their business, government doesn't get the money. This is a win situation for nobody. And it is confounding that the government hasn't put that together. I think they owe us all a much better explanation. And of course, when those workers are put out of a job, what are they going to need? Employment insurance. And where is the government on employment insurance? Well, they're adopting another boutique change to the program that is good for the people that it affects. And I am glad to see New Democrats have supported an adoption benefit under the EI program, but what we want is an adoption benefit under a new, modernized EI program, the kind that the Liberals have been promising for over 8 years now, so that the whole program serves workers better instead of just adding more things on to a system the Liberals themselves admit is broken. It doesn't make sense.
That's right.
And of course, better than employment insurance is a job, and we've supported investments in battery manufacturing plants across the country, but now we hear that those jobs may not be for people already in Canada after all. And that's a serious problem because it speaks to the government not having done its due diligence with these companies in ensuring that they're going to be hiring Canadians who are looking for work in order to do these jobs. And I think it also bears mentioning that a lot of those workers aren't necessarily coming through the TFW program. They're coming under the auspices of labor mobility sections in trade agreements negotiated by Liberal and Conservatives alike. In this case, the South Korean trade agreement that was negotiated while the Harper government was in power and the leader of the opposition was at the cabinet table. And when we're talking about emergencies, just a last bit, I want to talk about the Canada Disability Benefit, because there are no folks in Canada who are more hard hit by the current economic circumstances than Canadians living with disabilities who were promised a new benefit and the government has not been delivering. So I know I'm out of time, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to the question and answer.
Questions and comments?